Hey, everyone, we're just going to wait a minute or two more for everyone to continue to join, and then we'll get started. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. So thank you all for being here. We are going to go through some simple steps that I've kind of created over the past 10, 15 years in terms of how it can help you to really nail the medical school interviews, which are coming up in really the next few months. With regards to my background, I went to UCLA for undergraduate, and then I went to the University of Chicago for medical school. I didn't really have any really good advice at that time in terms of how to apply to med school, how to get into medical school. I was very fortunate to have a few opportunities that arose. I spent 6 years at the University of Chicago. I took 2 years off to do research. And during those 6 years, I was part of the medical school admissions committee. And during the last year, I was elected to be one of the 3 students that were part of the voting admissions committee. The admissions committee, their executive committee, was comprised of 12 people, and 9 of them were faculty and 3 of them were students, and I was one of those students. So that really gave me insight, the first few years in terms of interviewing applicants, but really that last year in terms of really the nuts and bolts of what goes into providing a medical school acceptance and really what everyone is looking for when you go on to interview. I since have completed my neurosurgery residency at Vanderbilt and a fellowship at Memorial Sloan Kettering, and now I'm attending down in Florida in neurosurgery. All right, so some interview basics. So I really mean this when I say you've done the hard part. So the hardest part of the whole application process is getting an interview. Because to get an interview, you have to have the scores, you have to have the interest, you have to have the personal statement, you have to have everything. It's basically a testimony of who you are. And when you've gotten that interview, that means that the medical school is actually interested in you being a student with them. So you've passed the medical school's basic litmus test. So now it's time for you to show the following. The first person, this is an order of importance. The first item is that you are a person that can engage and work well with others. Up until the interview point, your application is just a list of who you are or who you claim to be. But when you go and interview in person, this is the first time that they can say, yes, this is someone that I would want to be my physician. And that's really the key here is they want someone that they want to know that this is someone that will work well with others, someone that will work well with patients, and someone that is genuinely just great to be around. The second thing is that you are confident in knowing why you want to be a doctor. If you're going to medical school, you need to prove to the medical school admissions committee that this is something that you've thought through very meticulously and that you have very good reasons for why you want to be a doctor. The burnout rate is real in medical school and in residency, and they want to make sure that you know what you're getting yourself into. And then finally, the last point of an interview is really so that you can explain to the admissions committee why you would be a great fit for their medical school. And you probably will have already answered secondary questions that to this effect of why do you want to go to this medical school? But really, I can't emphasize enough how important it is to come in with a list of saying, hey, this is why I want to go to your medical school. So moving on, another interview basic, interview scheduling. This is the most important part of choosing that you can control. The interviewing early is better. Early is always better. I'll take it back to getting an interview. If you apply when AMCAS opens in July, you have about a 1 in 50 chance of getting an interview. If you apply in October, you have about a 1 in 300 to 1 in 500 chance of getting an interview. If you interview in August or September, you have a 25 to 35% chance of getting an acceptance. Whereas if you interview in February or March, you have less than a 5% chance of getting an acceptance. All this is to say, and I should make a note, this is with regards to both schools that have rolling admissions and schools that do not have rolling admissions. Even if they have rolling admissions or don't have rolling admissions, this statistic still applies. So the bottom line is schedule your interviews as early as possible, even if it means a little more expense in terms of travel dates, whatever it is, do whatever it takes to get the interview as early as possible. The next thing that I want to talk about is where to stay. A lot of times in medical schools, we'll have the option to stay with a host student. And if that's an opportunity, definitely take advantage of that for several reasons. One is that it shows that you're really interested in the school, learning more about the individuals that attend that medical school. But really, most importantly, is that those students can really give you insight into what they love about the medical school. And the next day, when you're at your interview, you can bring what you heard your medical student host into your interviews and say, you know, the second year that I was with really talked about, you know, the small group sessions and how you go from having a small group session and then you go and see it displayed right in an actual clinic. So those can be really powerful tools that you can use during your interview. Some bullet points that I always like to drive home about interviews. The first one is put away your phones. Your phones should never come out at any point during the interview day. So even when you're sitting down in a group of people waiting for your interviewers to come and there's no one officially presenting, you do not want your phone out. You want to be talking with the other interview applicants, reading something that you have. The only place I tell people that I coach you can take out your phone is in the bathroom. That is literally the only place. And when you take out your phone, the admissions committee notes it. It's always noted all over the place. This person was not engaged, their phone was out. Second thing is be nice to everyone. And I do mean everyone. The receptionists, when you walk in, they can have an influence in terms of, they can say, hey, this person was a jerk. And those comments go a long way. So just make sure you're extra nice to everyone. Be energetic and smile. That sounds cliche, but really you have to go in with the mindset of every single part of this process is an interview. I need to be engaged. I need to be someone that people want to be around. And the last one is never, ever complain. People don't like complainers. They don't want complainers to be in their classes. They don't want complainers to be going through med school, talking about the hard hours, talking about the amount of studying. They want people that are going to be awesome to be around. And so just get rid of complaining. The next topic that I'm going to talk about is what to wear. This causes people a lot of stress and it really shouldn't. The bottom line is you need to keep it as conservative as possible. Very, very, very conservative. For men, this just means wear a dark suit, preferably gray or black. Wear a white shirt. I say avoid colors because unless you have it white or blue, people will wear orange shirts, weird shirts like that. You just want to blend in as conservative. Wear a conservative tie, nothing bold and fancy, dress shoes, dress socks, belt. Be clean shaven unless you have a full beard. All I'm saying here is don't have, the 2 or 3 day shadow going. Be clean shaven or have a full beard. In terms of women, so I'm going to say women here have a harder time. There are way more comments made about what women are wearing than what men are wearing. Fair or unfair, that is reality of it. Skirt versus pantsuit dilemma. I'll tell you my bias would be to tell all of the girls to go for a skirt suit set. And the reason is if you have an 80-year-old surgeon that is interviewing you and you wear a pantsuit, he or she is probably not going to say anything about it. But even if there's some sort of bias, just go a little more conservative. Just make sure you're wearing a dress blouse that is a neutral color. Flats or low heels, don't wear anything near stilettos, anything like that. This next point that I have written under women, absolutely no cleavage at all. It is literally written in your interviews that, there was way too much cleavage coming out. So just be as conservative as possible. And the last thing along those same lines is that skirts must go below your knees. Again, this is a comment that we get over and over again. The skirt was riding up, where you could actually see your butt cheek or something. So just ride the line of being as conservative as possible. In terms of a typical interview day, what to expect. In the beginning, you typically have an introduction meeting, and this is usually with the dean of admissions or the entire admissions team. This is a great way to pay attention and to gather what they think the highlights of the medical school are, so that when you go and interview, you can actually go and bring in some of those topics that were discussed, because they're basically giving you the cheat sheet saying, these are the things that are super important to this medical school, and so you should incorporate those in your answer. Typically, you'll have 3 interviews. You'll typically have an admissions counselor or someone from the admin team that will interview you. Typically, they're looking for weaknesses in your application, like if you failed a class or if you have a low score in something. Typically, that's the interview that will really bring it out. The next one is a faculty interview. Typically, those are weighted the heaviest in terms of importance. Typically, there's a few faculty members, it might be 50 or 60, but those are the same 50 or 60 that are always doing it. And so the admissions committee is very familiar with how each one rates their interviewees. That one, you really just want to nail home, why do you want to be a physician? You want to be engaging. And then finally, the last one is a student interview. Most med schools have some version of a student interview. What I always tell people is that typically a student interview is weighed less, but what a student interview can do is basically flag people and say, this person definitely would not be a fit with the med school. And that's what the med school is really lean on the students for, is to say who should not be a med student at that school. And that just means, being formal with the student. Don't be arrogant, be someone that seems like that you would want to get along. Typically, you then have a hospital tour. Again, this goes back to the fact of women, don't wear, high heels so that you're pulling behind on the hospital tour. Then there's a lunch, and then there's chill downtime when you're waiting for other people to interview and your interviewer hasn't come. I'll say in that chill downtime, this just goes back to the fact, always be smiling, always be talking to other people, be engaging, and don't have your phones out during that time. Some other interview basics. Just remember, interviewers are people are biased, and they make conclusions, and that's fair or unfair. That's just the name of the game. Interviewing is a skill, and so you have to learn how to turn it on and lock it in. I put here, seek out resources. I will say people applying to medical school are some of the worst prepared people for interviews. If you talk to people that are going into management consulting or other business related fields, there are whole courses and workshops and actual, sessions that are designed to help people learn how to interview. And really nothing like that actually happens for medical school admissions. So know that you're behind and that you need to get yourself up to speed on this. And specific things that will help you with this. Introductions. When an interviewer comes and grabs you and says, hey, is David here for his interview? At that point, that's when the interview starts. And you say, hey, yes, I'm David. Nice to meet you, sir, ma'am. I am excited to be here. And then go from there. It's a handshake. It's a strong handshake. It's a smile. It's small talk. If you're walking to their office from wherever you're going, it's saying, it's a beautiful day in Chicago, in New York, wherever you are. And just having that conversation kind of flow easily. I put here, make it easy on your interviewer. That goes back to being engaging, but also when they ask you questions, think of it this way. When an interviewer is going through the interview, they're also a little stressed because they have to come up with the questions to ask, etc. And so you want to be providing them thorough answers that really make the conversation easy. The next thing that I put up here is this is an actual old form for how we would rate the interviews that we just did. You'll notice that the categories are authenticity, personal readiness, motivation for medicine, exposure to diversity, and interpersonal skills. And then the last one is fit. And that fit category would really be weighed more than others. But this is just to give you an idea of kind of, the categories and how everything is rated. I'm going to get into some specific questions that are asked on the interview. A lot of people always are concerned about preparing for, random questions. What I'll say about random questions is, there's lists on Student Doctor and everything that go into, tell me about a book or tell me about a poem, things like that. Don't focus on those crazy questions. If you get a crazy question like, tell me about a poem or what's your favorite poem, if you don't know poetry, just say, I don't know poetry, but I am a history buff, and so I've spent a lot of time in catching up on the Civil War history, whatever it is. The bottom line is they're not trying to stump you; they're just trying to prove that you're an engaging, interesting person. And so don't think of these as trick questions; just think of these as they're trying to get to know you questions. But there are a few questions that you need to have nailed down. The first question is, why do you want to be a doctor? 100% of your interviewers will ask you in some form, why do you want to be a doctor? And this answer, your answer to this, has to be rehearsed and effortless. This almost should come across as, it's almost like they've memorized this. And that's perfectly, this is the one question where that's perfectly fine. Because this is why you're doing this interview. And so you should have a 2 to 3 minute story rehearsed, down cold. When someone says, why do you want to be a doctor? Say, yeah, that's a great question. Being here, going on this long journey, let me tell you about my road to wanting to become a physician. And it needs to be a seamless transition into it. You should not seem like you are thinking about it. The reason why I'm harping on this so much is because about 30 to 40% of people fail to answer this question convincingly. That's a huge percentage when you think about it, being that this is the most obvious question. About 30 to 40% of people give either ambiguous or otherwise non-convincing answer for why they want to be a physician. So you need to make sure that you're not in that category. The last thing that I'll end on it with regards to this question is your story needs to basically explain what grabbed you to want to pursue medicine. But you need to say that because of all those influences, that led you to shadowing in a medical center, in a clinic, wherever it is. And this is true shadowing, not scribing, not something like that. So that you can say, I had this interest in medicine, and then I started shadowing. And that's when the light bulb went off that this is what I want to do with my life, that I want to have a life of service in the medical field, that is what I want to do. Despite the highs and despite the lows of medicine that I saw in the day-to-day day-to-day shadowing, I know beyond any doubt that this is what I want to do. The last thing that I'll say, this doesn't apply to most people, but in your question, why do you want to be a doctor? If you have parents or family members that are physicians, this should be nowhere near the start of your answer. The default for people that have physician family members is to say, why do you want to be a doctor? And to start and say, well, in my family, my mother was a physician, and so growing up, I constantly saw her. That just comes across wrong. If you take the other approach where you go through what drew you to medicine, even and what led you to shadowing, and then at the end say, and I know after shadowing, I really want to do this. And I've had a life where my mother has been a physician, which has just re-emphasized what I saw in shadowing, that this is the type of career I want to follow. So just avoid falling into that pitfall of just starting out blank with, a parent being medicine. The next question that you have to have pretty well down is, why do you want to go to a certain medical school? Whenever you go to a certain medical school, they're going to ask you, why do you want to come here? And you have to know why you are a good fit. And this can't be superficial things like, I love New York, or I want to be in Seattle because my family is in the Pacific Northwest. These have to be really, really specific. You have to talk about, maybe there's a very specific research opportunity that is appealing. Maybe they have a global health track that you're interested in. And you could say, I'm interested in this global health track because in undergrad, I worked with, underserved, battered women's shelters in India, and that's a passion of mine. So you have to be able to support why you're interested in it. But you have to pick out these small things that are very interesting about each medical school. Maybe it's where the medical school is located in the sense of, Columbia versus Cornell. Columbia is in a very impoverished part of New York, Washington Heights. And so they have a very different patient population, a very, uninsured patient population, homeless population is very prevalent. And so you could say, working with underserved communities in Columbia is a great opportunity. Whereas Cornell, you're going to have to come up with another, approach to that question, because Cornell is in the heart of Upper East Side, next to $1 million mansions. So those are the type of things that you have to kind of think about. And I put here, talk to students. This goes back to staying with the host, because they can tell you kind of what are the highlights of med school. And just listen carefully when the deans give you the initial talk of welcoming you to the interview, because they'll list highlights as well. I'll add that, so why do you want to go to a certain medical school? These are special considerations for top tier research schools. The top research, medical schools, when you're talking about, Harvard, Hopkins, when you're talking about, UCLA, all of these top research institutions, they're not really interested. They have a subset of people that are interested in going into primary care because, they want people going into kind of underserved medicine. But what they're really interested in is producing leaders in clinical medicine and leaders in academic medicine. And so you really have to try and emphasize your research background. I'll say this, though, that research is very loosely defined. The days of it being basic science, hardcore, wet lab experience are way far gone. The 5 categories I find it easy to break into research is basic science, which is the old school kind of wet lab methodology. Then there's clinical research. So if you were involved in, helping out with clinical trials, with, other just more broader clinical research, that would involve that. There's community service, and there's global health, which I talked about a little bit. And then there's medical education. Most people don't have exposure to medical education yet, but if you have a passion for teaching, you can kind of harp on that would be an avenue that you would really want to expand on. And so if you're applying to these top programs, you need to figure out a way to mold one of these topics to really be kind of who you are, what they can kind of market you as, because they want you to be successful in one of these 5 areas. And I'll go back to the thing that I said earlier is that these schools, you have to go in with a different mindset, because they want you to be a good doctor, but they're not interested in just, going into private practice and being, an oncologist in private practice. They may say on the surface that, people can go into different things, but what the medical school admissions committee is looking for at these schools is someone that's going to make a difference in the field by being a leader in clinical or academic medicine. I'll move on to some specific questions that you're going to get asked. This next one is an example of questions that will come up, and I just want to kind of teach you a framework to how to approach questions. It's very commonly asked, what leadership experience do you have? And I want to challenge everyone to, when you get questions like this, to rephrase the question and to think of what they're asking. They're not asking for a laundry list of your leadership experiences. That's what the question says, what leadership experience do you have? But they don't want that list. What this question is asking me is, tell me how you are a leader and how you will be a leader in medicine, okay? And when you reframe the questions like that, it becomes really easy, because you can say, that's a great question, because being a leader in medicine is essential. Physicians, all physicians, regardless of what specialty they are leaders in some form. I've had a lot of leadership experience in undergrad as, as a head tutor for multiple students. I was involved in, X, Y, and Z, where I had to do a bunch of organization. And then you want to take all those experiences that you've had and say, and, transitioning to being a medical student and then to be a physician, is going to require a large amount of leadership ability. And I'll take these skills that I have from my undergraduate experience, from my high school experience, and be able to apply those as I go on to medical school. So you can do that with all questions. What leadership experience do you have? What makes you what makes you an interesting person? You can rephrase all of these questions to really hone in on what are they asking for. The other thing to keep in mind, this last point, is remember that they have to fill out an evaluation form at the end. So if you're giving a vague list of things, that makes it harder on them. But if you tell them what leadership experience you have and you say, that's a great question. I've been fortunate to have a ton of leadership experience that will serve me well as a medical student, as a physician. And then you say, I had an opportunity to go to a women's battered shelter in India. That required a lot of preparation. It required a lot of, organization. It involved a lot of, contacting multiple sponsors, whatever it is. And you give them a list so that then when they go and give their feedback form, they say, yes, this person will be a leader. They gave specific things about their experience in India that will really help them a lot. So try and be specific so that it makes their jobs easier. I think I went back on that. So other specific questions, hard to answer questions. Avoid committing to a political side. You do not know how the person that you're talking to leans. Even if they give you some indication, they say, oh, do you hear, another Biden debate or, another, what was Trump doing? Don't make an assumption that you know what side of the aisle the person that you're talking to goes. If they ask you, how do you feel about the current state of, healthcare in America? Don't come out for or against, affordable healthcare. Say, there are a lot of amazing things about healthcare in the U.S. right now, in terms of, technological advances, in terms of surgical advances, in terms of research. But there's also a lot of areas that we can improve on. You can say, access to care is a huge problem in terms of how do you, provide for people, how do you get people in for preventative care? So there's ways to skirt around these, without committing to a specific political ideology. I have written here, be gracious if asked an inappropriate question. I kind of feel this kind of falls in the same category as almost, like I talked about earlier, women in cleavage. Should a woman be able to show cleavage? Sure. I mean, that's an individual agreement. But in this interview context, you want to play it as safe as possible. So if someone asks an inappropriate question, just be gracious, try and skirt around it. The last thing that I'll say is be prepared if you have any red flags in your application. Though that they just get asked, and sometimes they get asked in ways that are less than ideal. So just make sure that you have an answer for any low grades, those scores, anything like that. What do you do after your interview? Thank you emails. 15, 20 years ago in my time, we would send handwritten letters. But now I would say you 100% need to send emails. And they need to be short and sweet. They should be no longer than 3 or 4 sentences. They should say something specific to the interview that you had. And they should be sent really within the same day. I would say after your interview, you should go back to wherever you are, get internet on your flight, airport, whatever it is, and send them the same day. And the reason for that is they're going to write your evaluation probably that night or maybe the next day. And so you already want to have that written down and checked off and done. The next thing I'll say is the most common result after an interview is being waitlisted. That is perfectly fine. Typically over half of each class is accepted off of the waitlist. When you get waitlisted, you want to keep the lines of communications open. So you want to be sending them updates. You can send updates to typically the dean of admissions or whoever organized your interview. That's a direct pathway in which you can send updates in. I put here, have some updates in your back pockets. Some people have an extra letter of rec that they can send in, and basically it gives you a way to email and say, hey, I'm still very interested in this medical school. By the way, here's an updated, letter of recommendation. The reason why this is important is because when the waitlist starts moving, typically in May, June, when we go down and look at the list of people that are on the wait list, everyone that has sent in a communication saying, or an email saying, hey, I'm super interested, here's an update, has a little checkbox by it. And they get an extra check every time they send a meaningful email. So if you just say, hey, I'm still interested, probably won't cut it. But if you send 1 or 2 or 3, emails every 6 to 8 weeks, it'll be flagged. And when it comes to May or June, the medical school just wants to accept someone that fits their profile, but that they know will accept the acceptance. So have those update items ready. Make sure you maintain those lines of communication, because like I said, it's about 50% of each class comes from a wait list. Final word, I've kind of already harped on this, be positive, be a positive, enthusiastic applicant who people would want to be classmates with. A lot of people will say, well, not all physicians are, people pleasers. Radiologists, pathologists, those are kind of the stereotypes. But it doesn't matter, because they want to create an environment of collaboration. Even if you're a pathologist, even if you're a radiologist that's not interacting with patients, you still are going to be in a medical team. You're still going to be collaborating with multiple people, techs, nurses, all of the above. And so you want to make sure that you're conveying this idea that you are a collegial person. Smile, dress appropriately, give a good handshake, exude confidence, put away your phone, be engaging. Practice, practice, practice. This doesn't just mean by yourself. Practice with family members, practice with a coach, practice with whoever it is. A good resource for this is if you have friends that are going into management consulting. Like I mentioned earlier, the management consulting firms do a great job in preparing their applicants for the interview process. Ask people that are going into consulting to go over interview questions with you. You may think that you have it nailed down, but until you actually verbalize and go through the process, even someone not in medicine, they'll be able to say, you sounded arrogant. That was not a great way. So practice. The last thing I'll say is, know why you want to be a doctor, and why you want to go to that certain medical school. Those are kind of the core of each interview. Back to that. And that is it. So I will look and see if there are some questions, which it looks like there are a few. The first question says, what do you think about asking for feedback right after in-person interviews? I would say no, don't do that. The goal of an interview is to have a conversation, and that brings it back to a little too formal. And they're not going to tell you if you did a horrible job. They're not going to tell you did a horrible job. So I would not do that. How much overlap can there be between primaries and secondaries and interviews, especially with the why do you want to be a doctor? So a lot of times the primaries and secondaries will have questions like, why do you want to be a doctor? I'll say this, the overlap can be 100%. Typically, when I would interview students, I would spend 1 to 2 minutes looking over their application. The admissions committee spends more, but that means that I really did not read line by line your why do you want to go into medicine essay. So you can take your why do you want to be a doctor essay and basically verbalize that. That's perfectly fine. They're not going to remember exactly what you've written and everything. And actually, even if they did, that would just affirm, like, yes, this person knows why they want to be in a position. And then I see, what do you consider to be a meaningful update after an interview? So meaningful updates are something like a letter of rec, or if you got a new honor or award, if you got a new job, if you got a new poster presentation, something along those lines. You can still send them an email saying, hey, I'm interested, but it just helps to have those kind of meaningful updates. how do non-rolling admissions compare to rolling admissions? Honestly, they don't differ much in terms of the importance of how you interview. Really, the only benefit is that in rolling admissions, you find out earlier that you've been accepted. But what I'll say is that a lot of people think that rolling admissions, that you have an easier chance of getting in if you interview earlier. And that's actually a fallacy, because what the non-rolling schools do is they set aside the applicants that they want to accept early on. And so if they've accepted 80 out of 100 already, they don't go back to those 80 and say, we're non-rolling, so we haven't officially accepted, so we're going to go back and review that 80. They don't do that. Those 80 are pretty much already in, unless there's someone specific that was on the border. So it just goes back to the fact that you want to interview for all these schools as early as possible. For why this school, can I talk about school's affiliation with a place that has electives and research I'm interested in? Absolutely. I talk about Columbia and Cornell, the difference between them. I gave Cornell a little bad rep for being in a posh Upper East Side location. But one of the cool things about Cornell is that it's connected to Memorial Sloan Kettering, the Cancer Institute. So if you're interviewing there, you could say, I have a huge interest in medical oncology, surgical oncology, whatever it is. And so being literally across the street from Memorial Sloan Kettering, where you have a collaboration, there's plenty of, cancer researchers there, would be an incredible opportunity. So yeah, definitely use those. What does the community service type of research look like? So this would look like something like someone that is starting, different types of shelters, a pediatric shelter in low-income neighborhoods. And that could be for, nutrition. It could be for, just basic immunizations, things like that. Starting women battered shelters, things like that. That's a great way. Other community service type of research would be like access to mammography, in inner city, different things like that will look at, how do you increase access to medicine or specific preventative care. That would be the type of community service research that would be great. Is there a dramatic change in chances of receiving an interview for applicants who submit their app by Labor Day versus afterwards? Labor Day is pretty late. So I would say no, because even by Labor Day, you're already getting into the late period. I usually tell people that you want to apply. The latest I would recommend applying a primary is really within the first 6 to 8 weeks of AMCAS opening. And I would even say that 8 weeks is getting to the point where you're no longer early. How do admissions committees feel about applicants who talk about enduring traumatic situations like abuse in their application, or potentially political topics like contraception? If your whole story is about, your whole community service is about, providing contraceptive options to individuals in a specific cohort, then, own it and go for it. But I would say if it's not a huge focus, it's something that I wouldn't omit necessarily, but I also wouldn't focus on, if that makes sense. Yeah. Do you have any specific advice for virtual interviews? I think there are still a few places that give you an option between virtual and in-person. And if they give you the option, definitely do the in-person. Spend the money, go into debt, whatever it is. The statistics just show that when you do it in person, you have a much better chance of getting in. That's just because you can't put a value on meeting someone in person and really learning who they are. Someone said, how long should each of our answers should be? I would say you should, the why medicine answer, why do you want to be a doctor, should be, like I said, 2 to 3 minutes. I'd say for the other ones, leadership, things like that. What are you interested in, hobbies, things like that. Those should be around 1 to 2 minutes. But the bottom line is to remember that the best interviews are ones that evolve into conversations. So if the conversation is rolling, roll with it. Don't stop it because you're like, oh, I've said too much. Just let the conversation roll naturally. Those are by far the best interviews. What is your recommendation for how soon to return secondaries? Um, this really goes back to how many schools you've applied to. I'm a strong proponent of not applying to more than 25 medical schools for this reason. If you apply to more than 25 medical schools, you don't have a list that's narrowed to the region that you likely will get into. And you don't want to waste time on schools that you haven't thought seriously about. You should return secondaries within about 2 to 3 weeks when you get it. If you get to the 6-week mark, that's when the red flags start raising. And the reason why I made that first comment about not applying to too many schools is typically because when people apply to 40 or 50 schools, if you get a secondary from Harvard, if you get a secondary from Western Michigan Medical School, typically most people are going to fill out the Harvard secondary first, which means that if you have 50 medical schools on your list, you haven't really narrowed it down to kind of your range, even if you have some reach schools. And so you'll spend a lot more time typically on the ones that are reaches and not enough time on the ones that are maybe more in your area. Is being involved with reproductive care like Planned Parenthood that speaks about topics like abortion potentially harmful to my application? Absolutely not. What I would say though is that, I mean, you have to read the room. If your interview is with an OB-GYN, then typically most OB-GYNs are going to be sympathetic with you. But if you don't know, like, you can still say that reproductive health is a huge passion of mine, and I've worked with Planned Parenthood and everything. But you don't need to go into the nitty-gritty details. That's all I would say in that regards. How much preference is given to the military in the process? To the difference between National Guard versus active duty? I'd say no, they don't know the difference. There's no extra training that goes into making sure that people know, especially when you're doing like a faculty or student interview. That's a really med school dependent question, because some medical schools have a large military cohort, others medical schools don't. And it also goes back into, I think, service repayment and everything. So the bottom line is it varies by each med school. Do you have advice for virtual interviews when the person is not? The bottom line, everything stays the same. Just make sure that there's more room for awkward pauses. Just make sure that you're trying as hard as possible to kind of bridge that gap in communication. Is it a disadvantage to not list research as your most meaningful experience on the primary application? So I think that for most meaningful experience, you definitely have to have a shadowing clinical experience, is it? If you are going for a top research medical school, then research should be one of your top meaningful activities. Is it appropriate to ask questions of our interviewers? Absolutely. Ask them, what has your been experience here? What do you think, attracts students here? What keeps faculty here? All those questions. Absolutely. Again, it's supposed to be engaging. It's supposed to be a two-way street. And I think that's it. So thank you everyone for listening. Hopefully, I wish you all luck in the upcoming season.